Okay, we're 1 minute past the hour. It looks like most folks have trickled in here, so it's time to get started. I'm Josh Bays of Site Selection Group, and I'm excited to welcome you to this webinar that previews this year's enhanced and unprecedented statewide Kentucky Product Development Initiative. At the top of the webinar here, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping items. First, this webinar is recorded. We will make sure that everybody has a copy of the recording as well as the content and the slides themselves. Thirdly, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. As we're going through this webinar, any question that comes to mind, feel free to enter that into that function. On the back end, we will be monitoring those questions, and we will make sure to save time at the end of this to do our best to address every single one of those questions. Lastly, I want to note that this is one of two webinars. Today's webinar is meant to preview the Kentucky Product Development Initiative, cover the overview and the highlights, the process and critical timelines. And then we're hosting an additional webinar next week that's going to dive into the nuts and bolts of the application and how to participate in the program. Before we dive into any content, we want to hear a message from the governor on the Kentucky Product Development Initiative.
Chris, you're muted. We don't hear the audio.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about the Kentucky Product Development Initiative. This is such an exciting new opportunity. Now, I know I don't need to explain to this group why it's so important we continue to develop our portfolio of sites and buildings throughout the Commonwealth. But I do want each of you to know that Team Kentucky recognizes this need, and we're taking every step possible to ensure we have the necessary infrastructure in place to continue our record economic momentum well into the future. As we continue to build an economy that works for all Kentuckians, we need to be vigilant in our pursuit of quality employers. To achieve that goal, we must provide state-of-the-art sites and buildings that transform communities and support the industries of tomorrow. I'm excited for you all to learn more about the statewide competitive effort. And we truly mean statewide, because this program aims to benefit all 120 counties through either direct support for transformative projects or through additional economic opportunities. Better yet, the Kentucky Product Development Initiative encourages regional collaboration between our communities. Our state and local economic development leaders have done such a tremendous job of positioning the Commonwealth for long-term growth. When we work together, there is no limit to what we can achieve. We're not just talking about building a better Kentucky, we're actually doing it. Again, I want to thank all of you for participating today, and I look forward to seeing how each of your communities will capitalize on this incredible new opportunity.
That's a fantastic message from the governor. It's fantastic to have support from the very top. So today's webinar agenda, let's preview what we're going to cover today. First is we're going to hear a message from the secretary as well as KAED about this year's program, do a very brief introduction on SSG and how we're involved with this year's program, provide an overview, go through summary of just the facts. The cabinet has produced a fact sheet that outlines a lot of the critical information for participating in KPDI. So we'll talk about that. We'll go through the process and timeline of what applicants can expect from a process and timeline perspective, make sure everyone has contact information for any questions, and then we're going to host a Q&A. That said, I'd like to turn it over to the secretary and Bob Hilton, chair of the board of KAED, for a few words.
Hey, Josh, thank you very much. This is Jeff Nolan. For a lot of you, I just want to say hello to you. I haven't had a chance to work with you, but I've certainly enjoyed the last several weeks coming into the Cabinet for Economic Development. And I got to tell you, the team here is not only fantastic, but they're excited about what I consider to be an historic moment in economic development for the state of Kentucky. Thanks to the leadership of our governor, thanks to the involvement of all those who participate with the Kentucky Association of Economic Developers and all the local communities and our great friends in the legislature, a true collaborative effort has brought forth an historic opportunity of putting $100 million out there to really, truly make a difference. And for those of you who are practitioners in the world of economic development, I know how I feel about what we do every day. It's very simple. It's not about what we accomplish this week or this month, but success is about what we really do to create a better tomorrow for all Kentuckians and not just a few. What we do is all about legacies. Our legacy today is beginning an opportunity of how we bring forth the kinds of sites and the kinds of collaborative efforts to really bring in the kinds of jobs that make a difference, that help build communities, that help build neighborhoods that are so special throughout all of Kentucky. So let me just challenge us all. This is a legacy opportunity in our profession. It's a legacy opportunity for our state. Let's not just bring forth great sites and great dirt and great access for new jobs and the jobs of tomorrow. Let's bring together those interdependencies with the workforce folks, with our schools, with community leaders. Let's build the ecosystem necessary around these new product offerings to make sure that we bring the kinds of jobs that are going to transform lives for tomorrow. That's our opportunity. And that's why, for me, this is truly an exciting and historic day, thanks to the great leadership of our governor, the legislature, and all of our economic development practitioners. So thank you. And Bob, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks and welcome, Secretary. We couldn't be more proud to have you in that position. We feel strongly you are exactly the right guy at the right time for this point in Kentucky. So welcome. And I share the Secretary's enthusiasm for this program. I know I'm remembering back to 2018 when a previous secretary, a previous cabinet operation talked with previous chairman of KED and then President Matt Tackett about this idea, and it's evolved just exceedingly well with 3 years of pilot programs that were very successful through the program, and I think that shows the fortitude of Kentucky, that it's not exactly people doing things, but organizations in cooperation with the cabinet, KED, and as we saw through the legislature, the cooperative effort of the legislators and the governor's office to put this bucket of money, if you will, out there for us to do great things for Kentucky going forward. And I think will move the whole state of Kentucky up several notches in the country as we look for economic development. One other little bit of teaser, a preview, if you will. I mentioned previous President Matt Tackett, who worked very hard on this program and was an asset, but as most of you know, has left us for another great opportunity. But later on in this slide deck, you'll see a contact of a young lady that we have named our new president of KED. And I want to give this select group a preview of that we'll hear more about next week. But Miss Haley McCoy has graciously joined us, and we couldn't be more excited about her leading the ship at KED as well. So great opportunities. We really look forward to putting this forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Helton. So getting into the content of today's webinar, we're certainly not going to belabor introductions of SSG. We've had the benefit of being part of legacy programs, but are ecstatic to be a part of this greatly enhanced, transformative, unprecedented. You can come up with a lot of adjectives to generate excitement about this year's statewide program. But for those that we might not have had the opportunity to work with, very quickly, Site Selection Group's a corporate site selection firm that mainly focuses on helping companies find the optimal location for whatever it is that drives operational success. That being said, we often use that experience to do some economic development consulting engagements, and helping administer the Kentucky PDI program this year is an example of that. On the next slide, you'll see those team members at SSG that will be intimately involved with this program. And it's the same cast of characters. If you've participated in years past, it's the same cast of characters that will be available this time. So again, I'm Josh Bays. I'm a partner at Site Selection Group. My day-to-day role is managing the firm's industrial practice, as well as any type of economic development consulting engagements. As you know, in past years, there are two folks that I keep using the term intimately involved because they are really the brains behind the operation. The first is Chris Schwinden. Chris.
Hi, folks. You got Chris Schwinden here. I'm based in our Dallas headquarters. And first and foremost, just really, really excited for another and bigger year of the PDI program. It's funny. It's every fall for the last 3 years. We've kind of had an annual ritual of doing a road show across all of Kentucky. And it's been one of my favorite parts of the entire year. So excited to keep this moving. Where you'll see me is actively involved with the PDI program is I focus on the analytics behind both our corporate projects, but also our economic development efforts. So I'm leading a lot of the workforce analyses, target industry analyses. Basically, if you can throw some data and numbers behind something, that's where you'll find me. Josh?
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. And I want to introduce Beth Land. Beth, if anybody has had a chance to meet Beth, you know that at SSG you can throw tiles out the window, and we all report to Beth in this regard. She will be instrumental in this year's program. She's finishing a maternity leave, but she will be coming back to SSG in the coming weeks and will be just as involved in this year's program as she ever has been. She focuses from a site readiness perspective, technical site and infrastructure and that sort of thing. So we look forward to having her back. And then we're supported by, in my estimation, one of the most talented teams in the industry, and we can draw on that support as needed. So you might see a few names here and there involved in the programs, but day to day, it's myself, Beth, and Chris. Okay, so diving into this year's statewide KPDI program overview, what we want to start with is the why and the how. As we know, the legislature appropriated an unprecedented amount of $100 million for this enhanced KPDI initiative. The objective of that is to stimulate transformational economic development projects that create quality jobs across the Commonwealth. Those words are chosen very intentional. And as we talk through some of the key program definitions, funding details, eligibility, and that sort of thing, you'll see that all of it is in the spirit of stimulating transformational economic development projects that create quality jobs across the Commonwealth. There's one thing that needs to be noted here just to avoid any particular confusion. As you know, the cabinet this past year budgeted in the legislative session $100 million for this KPDI program, as well as an additional $100 million allocated to support mega projects over $10 million. Just to be clear, this KPDI program is separate and distinct from the additional allocation of that second $100 million. And we encourage all communities with eligible projects to apply to this particular program. So you might have seen $200 million out there. That's the bifurcation between the two, completely separate and distinct. And if you have an eligible project, we highly encourage you to apply. Chris, would you like to talk about some of the core project values that are consistent with how we've typically approached this?
Absolutely. And if you've participated in the program before or done any of these informational webinars before, these will look pretty similar. And one of the themes we'll strike on throughout this webinar and this year is that it's a consistent process with what we've done in the past, obviously with enhanced funding. So those three core values are critically important to us and critically important to the program. The first is a holistic approach. Obviously, analyzing sites, understanding the infrastructure requirements, the advantages and disadvantages of everything that goes in the dirt is important, but we really want to take a holistic approach, as we do with our corporate projects, of taking a hard look at things, especially on the workforce side, to make sure we're aligning kind of the dirt and the community value proposition. The second, which folds into that, is the concept of return on investment, of basically making recommendations from our perspective in the same way if we were spending our own money, of where is the highest and best use of these grant funds in order to support economic development across all of the Commonwealth and in particular communities. And that third point is understanding relative impact. of knowing that 100 jobs in more urban and prosperous communities is going to have a different impact than 100 jobs in a more rural community, and so forth. So we always want to make sure that we're doing our analysis, our scoring, and our recommendations based on both projects that are going to have an absolute impact on the state overall, but those that are also going to have a relative impact on especially smaller and more rural communities. Josh, you want to talk about kind of some high levels from just the facts?
I do, but you touched on something that I think we need to underscore. The beauty of this program is that it's allocating funds across the Commonwealth. And as Chris talks about relative impact, this truly is an opportunity for everybody to benefit. Rural, urban, east, west, central, north, south, doesn't matter. We're incredibly excited about this, and we'll talk about some of those funding details in a minute. So as you might have seen in some of the collateral, the cabinet has produced a document called Just the Facts. And basically what it is it takes all of the information from the legislature in this particular program and organizes it in an easy to read fashion that hopefully gives everybody a better understanding, a cheat sheet almost, if you will. Chris on his screen right here is showing an example of that. And by the way, there is a standalone website that is set up for this program. You can find that Just the Facts there. In that document, there are some key program definitions, and there's 4 that we need to touch on because it will help everybody have a better perspective of some of the things that we talk about when we start talking about the process. The first definition is an economic development project. Broadly speaking, those are site and infrastructure improvements that could result in an opportunity for the following bullet points you see there. And that's very well rounded. That's things from manufacturing and agribusiness and headquarters, to hospital operations, alternative fuel projects, non-retail service and technology activities. Again, when we're looking at economic development projects, we want to go back to one of the core tenets of the program: transformational economic development projects that create quality jobs. So I think the legislature has done a really good job of not bookending this too much. It really is open to create opportunity in a wide array of sectors. The second definition to touch on is who is an eligible grant recipient. That's local government and economic development authorities. Broadly speaking, the public sector. Those are who are eligible to receive these grants. An eligible project, there's some fine language here that determines what an eligible project is. That fact sheet goes into some more details, but it's broadly speaking those publicly owned properties. There are a variety of ways a property can be publicly owned or publicly controlled. That can be through a legally binding LOI, an option agreement, a sell agreement, where an eligible grant recipient, again, a public entity, controls that land. Kind of the cheat sheet, the way SSG thinks about that is the public sector controlling its own destiny with that site. That's the way that we think about that. And then eligible uses. There are some eligible uses here that are, this category has been widened from years past. It covers a broad array of things from due diligence studies, property acquisition, building construction, site prep, any type of infrastructure extensions, improvements, including roads. So there's a lot of ways to be able to expend these funds. Again, there's a complete list of all of this and that Just the Facts. I'm going to pause here and encourage everybody again, in case you missed it at the top of this, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your ribbon bar there. We're going to be covering some technical things, some process and programmatic items. If you have any questions at all, encourage you to input your questions in there. At the end of this, we're going to inventory those and we're going to do our dead level best to address every single one of them. So next, talking about the basic program mechanics. This is going to be kind of bifurcated into evaluation criteria and scoring criteria. Evaluation criteria are are those elements to which we judge eligible projects to be consistent with the program. We've already talked about property availability and it being publicly controlled. Again, there's a variety of mechanisms to publicly control something. Property development ability, is it free of material impediments? Zoning is a big one here of, can this be zoned for its intended use within 90 days? Transportation accessibility, is it or can it be adequately served for its intended use? And then utility adequacy, much like transportation, is the ability to serve it from these the major utilities for the intended use. Again, this can be led to interpretation. Obviously, some of these grant funds can be applied to any deficiency here, but if there's we call them fatal flaws at SSG. If there's a fatal flaw with a particular property where you just can't get over one of these, it's going to be a little bit difficult to get past from an evaluation criteria. So that's how we're evaluating projects. Now, on the other side of that is, how do you score applicants? How do you prioritize them and recommend them for grant funding? Chris?
Yep. So I'll touch on this from the scoring criteria side. The first one, if we'll hammer home a point today, is ROI focused, of evaluating both using data, but also our experience of the likelihood of project success at a particular site applicant, economic impact that's going to have, especially focusing on or including projects that can have a transformational impact on the state, and overall job creation. The second is evaluating how the site aligns with workforce characteristic. And that's frankly where I spend a lot of my time. So in the same way we would evaluate a community or site for a corporate project, evaluating applicants in this case, both from a desktop perspective. So how does the workforce data look, positives and negatives, both from a data perspective? But what's really important is when we get to those sites that and communities that have potential for recommendation, is conducting those site visits and taking a look at, on the ground, what does the workforce value proposition look like? What is the story in those communities from a workforce perspective? We can come up with countless examples from previous years on communities and locations that didn't score particularly well from a data perspective, but boy, when we got on the ground, just a fantastic workforce value proposition that we saw through visiting with stakeholders, visiting with training, visiting with community leaders and so forth. And then finally, the relative positive impact of knowing that 100 jobs in one community is going to be different from 100 jobs in another community. So taking that into account when we're making our evaluations is an important consideration. Josh, anything you would add on this slide?
Well, this dovetails nicely into just how this is a competitive program, and that's the reason we have to have scoring criteria, and we'll touch on that more in detail in the next slide when we talk about the funding details of the program. So speaking of funding details, we've talked about there's $100 million of total funds statewide for this particular program. There are several nuances that are worth covering. Again, this is covered more deeply in the language from the legislative session, as well as that just the fact sheet. But let's talk about the high level points. Each project can receive the lesser of what we're calling the county maximum funding amount, or $2 million. Funding for round one is going to be available based on county relative population to the state population. One exception with Jefferson County because of the size of Jefferson County. In that just the facts sheet, you will see the maximum funding by county. So that's how much of the $100 million can potentially be awarded to each project within a county. That begs the question of, yes, this is a competitive process. Just merely meeting the evaluation criteria and being the sole applicant in a county does not guarantee funding. It still has to be a competitive economic development project, again, transformational, that is intended to create quality jobs. The other point to make is it's very conceivable that we get through this round one and there are funds left over from that $100 million that did not get allocated. If any funds remain after round one, a second round will be initiated. Those remaining funds will be pulled and distributed using the same process and program requirements. So that is how the funding works for this. There's one other little nuance that is worth mentioning. Well, it's not a little nuance, it's an important nuance, and that is all funds require a local match. Whenever there's a local match, in the event a project has previously received economic development incentives, there could be restrictions around that, specifically recipients of state level TIFs or loans. We're not referring to any economic development grant that may have been administered through the Department of Local Government or any form of other federal grant programs. The goal is for a community to not be able to use this program to pay off an existing loan or debt from a previous program. So there's going to be a local match component to it. And then that nuance about not using this to pay off, again, other debts or loans from previous programs. Again, I suspect we're going to have several questions about this. We're happy to talk through the details in the Q&A session. So now diving into the program process and timeline, how are we going to make this happen? What does it look like from an element of time? Chris, do you want to talk high level of the key 6 steps?
Sure. And what we'll emphasize here as well is that obviously it's an enhanced program. It's a bigger program this year, but the overall structure is going to be very similar to what we've seen in previous years as we were kicking off PDI. So it starts with an LOI, goes to a full application that we review, leads to site visits and a detailed evaluation, which ultimately results in SSG making recommendations and then providing something we feel passionate about is providing feedback to communities. So this is the high level, what you see on this slide. Let's kind of talk turkey here in terms of the actual dates for each of those steps. So what we're going to do very soon after this webinar is distribute program materials and the application. Those will be available on the website that we'll highlight here in a second. We've got some questions about where that is. We'll put that up on the screen along with the URL. So we'll be getting those application materials out. We'll talk in detail here in a minute about what those are. The first step, and it is a letter of intent. Basically, it's just it's a notice to us and the cabinet and KAED of the interest in applying for the program. The deadline for that is August 5th. This is just an important point for us because it really helps us get organized, start our data analysis, start getting organized for the rest of the fall. So encourage folks as best as possible. If you're thinking about applying, please go through the LOI process. It's a boilerplate document. We'll highlight that in a second. Then, as in previous years, the full application, we'll talk about that in detail. Application deadline is September 16th. Same amount of time as that we've had in previous years. And we've made some minor adjustments to the application. We'll talk about that in a second. Gives SSG in step 4 an opportunity to evaluate communities from a desktop perspective, both based on the application materials. And again, in the same way we would for a corporate project, evaluating from a workforce data perspective. First week of November, we'll give notice to folks of who we intend to come conduct site visits with. Have that as November 4th. We had really good participation and cooperations in previous years of having kind of a relatively quick turnaround between giving notification to communities and getting on the ground and visit. We've got that scheduled right now in that step 6 site visits for November 14th. We would just encourage folks to be as flexible and cooperative as possible because we anticipate seeing a heck of a lot of the state in this round of site visits. Thereafter, after those site visits in late November and December, SSG goes back, We fully evaluate everything, both from a desktop perspective and from what we've gleaned from the site visits, and making recommendations to the cabinet right before Christmas time. And then finally, providing feedback to applicants that'll probably happen in the new year. Couple minor points, or a couple specific points I'll highlight here, is that one, after the application period closes on September 16th, applicants can start incurring costs that could be reimbursable if they are selected for funding through the KPDI program. So just highlighting that. And then finally, what you see, the timeline you see on the screen here, is for us to get from where we are today to making recommendations. There's obviously going to be a process through KEDFA to award the actual grants and so forth. Josh, is there anything I overlooked from kind of a timeline perspective on this?
No, you touched on that last part. That's important. It's not shown on here, and we intend to cover that in next week's webinar. Again, next week's webinar is designed to go through those program materials and application, address some frequently asked questions, make sure everybody feels good that they understand the directive of how to apply for the program. And by the way, Chris mentioned this, those documents are going to be live on the website well prior to next week's webinar. So you can begin previewing those, and that might even make next week's webinar make a little bit more sense. But we highly encourage any interested applicant in attending that webinar as well. We think it'll make everyone's, specifically the applicant's, life a little easier as you start assembling all of that information. Now, Chris, I know there's kind of two steps where the applicants are more involved in SSG during the application and site visits.
Exactly. And that's a good segue, Josh, just what you talked about, posting these application materials on the website. That'll happen in the next couple days, well in advance of next week's webinar. But there's three things that will go into that. One is the program literature. Basically, it's a summary of a lot of the things we've talked about today from a timeline perspective, but also some more detail on the application process. Not just how to fill out the application in Excel, which is the second point, but some of the required documentation that we'll ask for as part of the application process. For those who have participated in previous years, this will look similar, obviously with some updates, but it'll look similar to what you've seen in previous years. The second is, we're calling it a request for information. It kind of mirrors a classic RFI that you would see on the corporate side. This is where we're collecting a lot of information about the particular site, the community, and so forth. We've made some edits to this based on changes to the program in this year, the enhancements. We've also tried to streamline this in a couple spots. So hopefully this will make it a little bit easier for folks to complete. And then finally, that letter of intent template. Frankly, it's a one-page Word document that is just pretty simple to fill out and give us notice of, you anticipate applying for the program. Here's where the site is. Here's what we anticipate kind of the uses and so forth. That's the application materials. Again, will go live on the website here in the next day or two. Josh, anything you'd touch on here on the application process?
No, I think you've got it covered.
So then let's go to the site visit side. This is the other big component that will happen, especially for communities and sites that are going to continue on for potential recommendation. Again, I alluded to this at the top. It's frankly my favorite part of the program, is getting on the ground and seeing a lot of different communities and sites across all of Kentucky. We already noted on the timeline that we're holding a week in early or mid-November, I should say, for site visits. We'll ask for folks' flexibility because we'll obviously be connecting the dots from a logistics perspective across a lot of different communities across the Commonwealth. And what we'll accomplish on those visits is, again, what you would do on kind of a classic site visit, a meeting with the economic development folks, the key utility providers to help provide further kind of understanding of the site, and then other community stakeholders, a windshield tour, a property tour, and then as needed, talking about workforce as well, meeting with either existing employers, training, education officials, and so forth. The one point we'll make on this is that We anticipate, and frankly, we hope that we see some applicants and some communities that have applied in previous years, in addition to ones that we visited in previous years. So we just anticipate making a common sense approach of, if you've gone through the entire kind of site visit, for lack of a better term, dog and pony show in previous years, and we're going to come back and see you, we just want to make sure that streamlines, that we're not taxing resources. We know things get busy, especially during the holiday season. So that's what we're looking to accomplish on the site visit side. Josh, anything you would add on site visits?
No, I just want to underscore the whole common sense and not taxing resources. While SSG is tasked with the huge responsibility of making recommendations for $100 million, and that's a responsibility we take incredibly seriously, there's an element to this of, we don't want this to be an overly burdensome process because we want it to be inclusive. We don't want the lack of a community resource to be a bottleneck or a constraint for applying to the program in the event they do have that opportunity of a transformational project that creates quality jobs. And so we encourage communication throughout all of this. Again, this is not meant to tax your resources. In the event there are certain elements where we can use common sense, we will absolutely do that. And I believe that's a good segue into the next part of this, which is the contact information. As you're working through this, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to reach out to any one of us. You've got the SSG team here. Chris, in the short term, is going to be the applicant's main point of contact, but that's not to say you can't give myself or Beth a call or shoot us an email. You see the resources from the cabinet, both Christina and Sarah being intimately involved in this. You have their contact information there. And then, as Mr. Hilton mentioned at the beginning of this, we're ecstatic to have Haley join the process from KAED's perspective, and she will be the main point of contact. But I just cannot reiterate this enough. Please feel free to reach out to us at any point in time. And the reality is there might be an answer we don't know the answer to, but we will try our dead level best to get you something quickly. Before we dive into Q&A, I'd like to invite the secretary and Bob to cover anything you think we might have missed, or is there anything that you think we need to emphasize a little bit more?
First of all, very well done. Thank you for that. And looking at 168 participants, I know it was great information. You might go back and articulate a little bit more why the regionalism is going to matter, and why also we're encouraging everyone to think of ways to come together and create a regional project, both the maximum funding benefits that can come by pooling those projects together, but also the way in which I think a regional effort will score better. So Josh, you might want to expand on that just a little bit more.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important point, Secretary, of just regionalism. I mean, taking a step back to fundamental economic development, when you start talking about the transformational impact projects have, we all know that they don't stop at political boundaries, whether that's a city, a county, or what have you. And especially in today's day and age, where it just seems projects are getting substantially larger from a headcount and a CapEx and a utility perspective, that regionalism to be competitive really is important. It's incredibly important. And Secretary mentioned that, a good part of this is each county's, I hate to use the term allocate because it's obviously not guaranteed, but there are funds earmarked for each county that can be pulled together to kind of grow that pie and maybe have a bigger impact for a project. And so as we're talking about relative impact and return on investment, some of those things Chris mentioned, regionalism will be a very big factor in that.
Yeah, Josh, I'd emphasize when we use words, sometimes I want to make sure that they're understood. The spreadsheet that shows funds by county, to your point, that's not an allocation and they're not even reserved. It's a maximum amount that each county can participate in, which actually then goes back to some of the benefits of thinking about things happening regionally, because you can pool those maximum amounts together to perhaps even do a larger project. And so while the funds show a spreadsheet, those are not funds that are set aside for each community. They are the maximum amount to then make sure that 100 million is being spread across the state, but it is still very much a competitive process. And I think all the participants would agree. That's one of the benefits of making sure we're going to get really great transformative sites, is making sure that everyone is participating, got some skin in the game, and are making these kinds of projects really the strongest and the best they can be, so that we can win opportunities against all of the states, because of the great work I know that the communities and the economic development professionals are going to be doing together to collaborate in presenting these applications.
I agree fully with that. I think statewide, we need to think regionally, combining assets from a number of counties, multiple counties, can really create huge impactful projects in a local regional area. The other point I'd like to lay out too from a KED perspective is that with this funding from this current legislature, they've given us a monumental opportunity with this amount of money. So coming up with good, solid, effective projects is vitally important. We're really under pressure, if you will, to perform as the legislature expected we would, and we're willing to set this money aside for us. So two things I would ask of you locally is, one, thank your legislatures for giving us the opportunity and expressing the confidence that we can perform under this method, but also as we perform and come out of this 2-year biennium, that we're able to go back to the legislature and say, here's the successes we had, here's how well we performed with the money that you set aside for us. We want to do it again. So keep it in mind, that longevity of this program as well.
Fantastic. All great points. What you see here on the screen, we've got a couple of questions about where is all of this information? How can I access it? There's a website there. That's going to be the central repository. Chris is showing you an example of what it is here. This is where program materials are going to be. This is where just the fact sheet is that he's clicking through. We're in progress on working on a frequently asked questions as those questions come in to try to proactively get in front of some of those things. So in addition to being more than welcome to contacting any one of us, feel free to use that as a resource as well. And we'll collectively do the best job we can of making sure everything is housed there. That being said, we've got 15 minutes, which should allow us to cover quite a bit of ground. And truthfully, we must have done a good job, because there's not a tremendous amount of questions. But let's go through some of these. So the first is, does eligible infrastructure, meaning I assume you're talking about eligible uses for funds, include utilities, lighting, fiber, that sort of thing. Infrastructure extensions and improvements are absolutely an eligible use for this, infrastructure being utilities. If there's some type of deficiency that these funds can help offset, and that's going to create a very competitive opportunity. Absolutely.
And there's a follow-up question there, Josh, on utility adequacy being an evaluation criteria. How do we take that into account? Is exactly, if we've got a site that with utility extensions, with bringing those utilities to the site, would make that a much more competitive site. That's absolutely getting to the point of ROI in terms of improving something, getting it ready for a real economic development project. So to that question, yeah, absolutely.
There's one thing I want to touch on there, and just when you talk about utility adequacy, one of the things we're going to take into consideration, and we kind of always have, is not only availability but capacity. If we're looking at, as the secretary talks about, some really large regional project that people are collaborating on for some type of, for lack of a better term, mega site or something like that, well, the threshold for utility capacity is going to be a lot larger than some project looking at a 20-acre site that is trying to just have competitive project for that good mid-sized project. So that stuff will be taken into consideration. Let's see. There's one question here, and I'm actually not sure I know the answer to this. Is the Port Authority an eligible grant recipient?
You don't have to turn the video on. Hey, Josh, this is Katie Smith with Economic Development Cabinet. Yes, river ports are eligible under that evaluation criteria. That's one of the things that they are considering, all of the different evaluation criteria. You don't have to meet every single criteria because I know one of the things with river ports is they are in a floodplain, and so they're not exempt. They're eligible to apply and be eligible for these projects and the funds.
Yeah. There's another question here is, will an applicant be limited in how much the PDI funds can contribute to property purchase? I think to my understanding, the limiting factor is the county maximum or $2 million, whichever is less. That is what is going to be the limiting factors, assuming it's a single applicant per county. And then the second part of that question is, if it is limited and the option or purchase agreement is more than what the PDI can contribute, can the applicant let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Will you still contribute if other third parties agree to fund the gap? So I'm interpreting that question to be, if there's a property that's relatively expensive, let's say that it reaches the $2 million cap, there's still some type of additional gap. You've got a public entity making the dollar for dollar match funds, and there's still a gap. Can a third party agree to fund that difference? I'm not exactly sure the answer to that question, and that might be one we need to get back to.
It's up to the cabinet again. Sorry, Josh. Yes, it sounds like this is just a capital stack for purchasing the property. So yes, we feel like that would be eligible.
Okay.
In fact, it's a good thing when the more funding that comes in, the more complete the project, the more it's going to score well. So that's not a limiting factor. That's actually one of the opportunities that each community or each regional project can take on their own, is to find other resources to bring those dollars in.
Will grant investments from other agencies and programs such as CDBG, AMLER, or the Appalachian Regional Commission qualify as part of the local match requirements? We can discuss that and get a question answered on that.
Let's first be candid and straightforward here. CDBG funds flow through the state, therefore it is actually a state prerogative unless it's in an entitlement community. You got ARC funds and others that flow through or come from or part of the state bucket. That's not a local match. And so I think that, we need to go back and clarify and come back, but on a going in answer to that, I don't think any community should look at state funds or funds that flow through the state as the methodology by which they're going to show their qualifying match. Now, can they be included in the project? Absolutely. Can they come in and if you will, round out what it takes to make this a transformative opportunity? Absolutely. But I don't think that you're going to find that you're going to score well if you're relying upon state flow through funds or state funding to be your entire match. There is a requirement of local match, local participation, whether it's from contributors, from the government. There needs to be that local participation in here. And I hope that, that clarifies it. We'll put that in our frequently asked questions, but I think you need to take that as the given answer going forward.
Similar to that, can the local match be provided through a public-private partnership?
Absolutely. Now, I think I want to put a caveat out here. If there is a situation where it's a public-private partnership and an investor is putting in the funding for the park, and they're expected to be repaid based upon land sales, and they somehow are a participant in guiding, controlling, and determining the use of the project, I think that would nullify. But if there is even a public-private partnership for the funding base, but the management, operations, and decision-making in the park are fully from the public sector, I think that would then qualify. And again, I go back to that, that's some additional details that we can try to put into our frequently asked questions.
Secretary, I use my words, and these are my words, so feel free to make sure that we're speaking clearly. I keep using that the public sector can control its own destiny with a site. Do you feel that's consistent with the spirit of what we're trying to do?
Yeah, and that's why I go back to, we're not going to exclude public-private partnerships, but we've got to make sure that it is publicly controlled, and the public is controlling their destiny, because it gets complicated when you're trying to find paybacks and things like that. So I think it's difficult to give a given answer, but I go back to the spirit by which this is being done. I think the criteria is pretty clear, and I think everyone should look at that relative to how well they will score in terms of coming in and being deemed eligible for this project and for this amount of funding.
Perfect. We've got a question here. Can the funds be used for a spec building? I mean, one of the eligible uses is building construction or renovation.
Chris, Josh, I noticed there are a couple of questions in the chat box. I don't know if you're monitoring that as well.
Yeah.
Chris, will you take a look at that? I'm going to keep working my way through this Q&A here. And
Yep.
I'll take it to you here in just a minute once you've had a chance to review. So what's the match? The dollar for dollar local match? We've talked about that.
So in the chat, we've got a question of, if a city received an approved grant in a previous year, and the city has an additional site or industrial park along with funds available, can the city apply, or can the economic development apply for this round? And I believe the answer is absolutely yes. Previous rounds aren't impacting whether you can apply for this round.
The answer is yes.
There's a detailed question on what population estimates were used to establish the max for each county. This is a demographic population question. I believe it's the updated 2020 census, but I'll defer to others.
Yes, Josh, you're correct. As outlined in the statute is the 2020 population census.
Yeah.
Good deal. And these are all fantastic questions. Where, like I said, we're doing our best to address them, and any that we need to clarify further, as the Secretary said, we will absolutely do that. If you apply for $500,000 and cannot award the total, will amounts less than $500,000 be considered? For example, only $250,000 is available, $250,000 is available. Would that be considered? I think first and foremost, don't request more than the county maximum, or $2 million, whichever is less. Is it conceivable that partial amounts could be awarded? Chris, how have we done that in the past? Do you recall any instances of that?
I don't offhand, and it'll be a little bit different since we have those kind of thresholds already set. But I guess when we had a blanket per project minimum in previous years, we'll have to double check, but I believe we made some recommendations on something that was above that, but we still funded it or recommended funding it at a lower level at the threshold.
Cabinet, do you have any comments on that?
The only other thing I would add is, because I don't know for sure, I want to make sure they understand that even though there's a maximum available funds per county, the county may have 3 or 4 projects that we want to submit applications for that may total up to that. So you don't have to submit one application for your full maximum available, even though your project may be less than that. So I do want to cover that you can submit multiple applications for multiple projects in those communities. And if they do move forward, because we have had some projects from the pilot program that moved forward and they were awarded funds, and thankfully, their projects came in under budget, so they received their eligible reimbursement for their maximum. They just didn't get the full amount of the award because their project came in under budget. So
Yeah, there's a question about who or what are the best partnerships for the local match. Do those partnerships need to be in place before the application? I think by the application, it's got to be pretty clear where that local match is coming from so we can make sure it's eligible. We talked about regionalism and community side. If there's a smaller, more rural county, does that give an advantage in the process because they're looking regionally? I mean, that's one of the core tenets of this, is to promote regional economic development. I mean, we can't say it's a hard and fast rule. We have to take everything into consideration, but regionalism is a core tenet here. Just confirming the dollar match. For example, if a county is awarded $2 million, the county would have to match $2 million of their own funds. I mean, it's a dollar for dollar local match. So I guess in this straightforward example, yes, there's one little nuance that's in that fact sheet that we didn't explicitly talk about when we talked about the dollar for dollar match. And that is if you're applying for grant funds for property acquisition, funds spent on due diligence can be used as a part or all of that match, depending on how that math works out. There's a question about the 100 million allotment for mega sites, where that's a completely separate and distinct program. There's going to be more information coming about that in the future.
Yeah, there's a question on that on the chat side too, so covering that one.
Is there an application fee? What about multiple applications? Katie, do you have any comments on that?
Bob, I believe this may be more for KED. I believe, Bob, I think there was an application fee that you all charged in the past. I could be wrong, but maybe $500. And as I mentioned earlier, yes, there can be multiple applications. Bob, do you want to chime in? And
yes, that application fee as in the past would apply here as well. Same criteria as previous years. And I'll go ahead and say this. I want to be sure that we make it very clear and that this is a criteria-based program, and all applications and projects will be judged based on this criteria by the consultants. This will not be a local or state level evaluation. So we just need to make crystal clear to everyone that this is a program based strictly on criteria as listed in just the facts in the application.
Absolutely. Well, we are nearing the time allotted here. We've answered the vast majority, if not all, of the questions. There might be one or two that slipped by us. We will absolutely make sure that those get captured in a frequently asked question. Before we close,
Josh, before we go, I think at the risk of going over time just a hair, there's a really good question, and actually I really appreciate the individual who asked, who said probably for the secretary. It seems like the deck is still stacked against rural and impoverished communities. The dollar for dollar match make especially far eastern Kentucky counties, even if several partners come together, at risk of not scoring well. Let me just go back to the presentation and a couple of things. First of all, these are the guidelines that came out from the legislature, and many members of the legislature representing many of the different communities in our state came together to put this package together. And quite candidly, I think the relative scoring criteria was emphatically put in here so that judgment will be used. And no one should think that the cards are stacked against them, because in fact, if you are applying either with other communities or you come from a community that doesn't have the same level of resources as many of the other counties in the state, and there's all kinds of data to be able to look at that. That's one of the reasons that the relative impact scoring is going to be looked at. Now, Does that waive the match requirement? No, it does not, because that's what's in the legislation. But what we would encourage is as being as creative as you can be, working with your local units of government, getting us involved, getting everyone involved to try and help, because the intent here is to make this really impactful for all the communities. And that's why that term relative is in there. And let me then also go fast forward. That's one of the reasons that Bob points out. The state's not making the decision per se. It is the criteria and the evaluations that's coming from the independent consultant. And what I like about the consulting team that we've been using is, first of all, they've been doing it for 2 years, but more importantly, they're providing their judgment based upon the one hand, how companies that they work with would look at these kinds of sites, but then on the other, based upon their work with communities over the years, what's that relative impact? What's going to really bring kind of impact that you need in that community? And they can do that without any kind of bias at all. And so there really is the checks and balances in here and the intent to make this something really good for every community, albeit it still requires all of us being creative, looking at ways and finding that regional collaboration, especially where matching funds might be limited, to have that biggest relative impact.
That's right.
One other point I'll make too, and I meant to do this at the beginning, but we as a state need to thank our major utility partners who collaborated together to fund KED hiring our consultant and making that a possibility. So you see a major utility partner, thank them for that as well. And thanks to SSG for their great work.
Certainly appreciate that, Bob. Is there anything?
I want to thank also the 168 participants, because look, it's really all about what the communities and the elected officials and the economic development officials who know their community the best, they're the ones who are going to make this successful. And so I just want to thank all of them for their interest, for their participation, and you all, the professionals, you are the ones that know exactly what your community needs. Make sure that comes through in the personality of your application.
Are there any other closing words, Secretary or Bob, that you'd like to offer before we close out?
Just couldn't be more excited about the program and really look forward to seeing a large number of high quality applications coming in.
I'll close it out real simple. What a great opportunity. What a chance to create legacy across our state. And more importantly, what a great chance to collaborate across so many different avenues in making this project a real way in which we can create jobs and transform lives for generations to come.
Fantastic. Very well said. We look forward to seeing all 160 participants back same time next week to talk more details. In the interim, if you have any questions at all, please reach out to us, and we look forward to getting started. Thank you.